What's up, everybody? Welcome to Christianly. This is your host, Brad Andrews. As always, thanks for joining us for this edition of the Christianly podcast. As we say each time we're together, this podcast exists to cultivate holy courage in you. Now, this summer, we have been doing a series within the podcast on the issue of politics. In particular, we've been thinking about the midterms that are coming up here at the end of the year in our country and in our state. In fact, where we record this podcast today is right next to a gymnasium, and in that gym, there are people voting in our state's primaries today here in Oklahoma. So I'm feeling the vibes from that even today as we're talking about politics. And again, this question of whether or not Christians should be involved in any way in politics, or maybe we could ask, should Christians be political? And so today is actually part 3 of that series. We've done a couple before these. One, we talked about the gospel being political, ways in which Christians can be political. In part 2, we talked about how do we think about voting as Christians. And today in part 3, I want to do something a little different. I want to answer some questions that have come to me as a pastor in thinking about what it looks like practically to be political as Christians. These are real questions from real people that I've received. I'm not going to name names, but these are questions that have actually come to me, and I want to give some answers to those questions. I think that might be helpful for us as we think about, particularly on the ground, like how do we do this? We've talked very philosophically up to this point, but I want to talk today very practically with you. All right, question number 1 is this. I am a registered Republican and consider myself a political conservative of the type that is increasingly unwelcome in that party. Given that we are in a supermajority state, and he's talking about the state of Oklahoma, I plan to leave the top of the ticket blank, something that I've never done before, as I understand it to be the clearest signal that I can send to party officials that I am unhappy with the choices that I've been given. My answer would be, I recognize that you are unhappy with, as a conservative, the choice that you've been given. I often am too, but the reality is that the choices we've been given are the choices that we've chosen. In other words, we are at the top of the org chart in a constitutional republic. So the choices that we have reflect the choices that we want on some level. Like, even if we've been very politically engaged in trying to get our candidate elected in the primaries, our preferred candidate doesn't always make it to the final round. So at that point, what do? You really have 2 choices. We can re-engage and consider the options that are actually before us, or we can do what you're asking, or what you're going to do according to your conscience, and protest those choices by the way of abstention. And I think the first option that I just mentioned, rather than the latter, is a more prudent decision practically, but you are free to make a different call if you feel that way. Second, though, I think that the idea that sending a signal to state party officials by abstaining from voting isn't received in the way that you think it will. In other words, our ballots are just recording votes. And unless we're trying to play the long game of building a coalition of like-minded people to offer another option at some point in the future that we think will be a viable choice, I don't see state party officials receiving that message in a single election. In fact, I think they will continue to simply see what they've always seen, even in our state, that the majority of conservative voters overwhelmingly voting for the conservative candidate. Now, the third thing that I would say in response to this question, and it's connected to the last point, is even in a red state, if you abstain at the top of the ticket, I think it's better to remember that every vote in every state affects the margin of victory for the winning candidate, and that's important. Now, Oklahoma, yes, is very red, but in the instance where a candidate wins both the electoral college and the popular vote, like let's say for the presidential election, and maybe by a large margin, it either indicates for an incumbent that there is a mandate for things to continue the way they are, or for the new official to lead strongly in a different direction. If the margin of victory is slim, those options lessen dramatically. And I might even argue that for a conservative, they would want their own state to get even redder. And by that, I mean that even in an overwhelmingly conservative state, like the state of Oklahoma, there are others like us, voting even more overwhelmingly conservative gives an even stronger mandate to the candidate. In our state, in Oklahoma, the conservative candidate has hovered between maybe 60 to 65% the last 10 presidential elections, with the exception of two, one in 92 when Perot garnered 23% of the vote, and in 96 when we had the lowest voter turnout of the last 10 years. So what kind of message would it send if that was 70% or even 80%? For a conservative, it would first ensure their values and policies are solidified to prevent shifts that might lead to future changes in government. I think it also will give them the ability to push back even more strongly against policies federally that conservatives may view as overreaching or harmful. And lastly, that they have a judiciary that reflects even more strongly conservative interpretations of the law. Now, another thing I would just say broadly connected to that point, if you ordinarily vote for the conservative candidate for president, let's say, but decide not to do that in this upcoming election, then the Democratic candidate needs one less vote to win the election. And it works the other way around too. And if all evangelical Christians followed that example, the Democratic candidate would win, because traditionally, according to the conservative candidate's biggest block of supporters, those are evangelical Christians. Evangelicals who decide not to vote affect the outcome in a disproportionate way. This is such an important point. They will, on average, effectively withhold 5 times more votes from the conservative candidate than they withhold from the Democratic candidate. George W. Bush, for example, became president with only 537 votes in his favor in Florida in 2000. So our votes or non-votes matter. Now, all of what I said, this is a long answer, but all of the above does not take into consideration all the reasons for why you are abstaining. This is just my attempt to share what I think are the things that prudence considers, even if you are considering abstaining. All right, here is question number 2. I agree that political voting and advocacy are in large part votes for access, and we're likely to have more seats at the table in a Republican administration. However, in recent years of challenges to religious liberty, the federal courts and Supreme Court have consistently upheld our First Amendment right to religious liberty. In my view, then, a federal official has very limited ability to infringe on my religious rights. Isn't that correct? Hey, that is a really good question. And without getting into the weeds, I just want us to look at the highest level of this, the Supreme Court. So to your point, it has both, the Supreme Court, directly and indirectly protected religious liberties in the past few years. In 2022, the Kennedy versus Bremerton School District case, the NFIB versus OSHA case in 22 as well, the Little Sisters of the Poor versus Pennsylvania back in 2020. This is in large part due to the fact that Trump was president at a crucial moment and appointed judges, along with the help of the majority's party, control of the Senate, who were then confirmed. If the Supreme Court leaned more liberal in that moment for those decisions, my contention is that you could have seen more infringement directly and indirectly on religious freedom. Now, I admit that it's hypothetical in a sense. There is a possibility that in the future, 1 or 2 more Supreme Court justices, like the near future, will retire. A lot of conversation around that. The makeup of the presidency and the Senate determine which justices will be on the court. So I just don't think it's a very strong argument to only look at precedent. You have to also consider the future as to whether the makeup of the Supreme Court, federal officials, right, moving forward would have the potential to infringe on your religious rights. Like, it really should be a both and consideration. All right, question number 3 says this. I agree that our faith speaks to how we should vote based on social issues, and the Republican Party is better on this issue, even if we've seen them waver, as there have been political losses nationwide on this issue following Dobbs. I also agree that Christians should advocate for a pro-life position. Politically, I think it's more complicated than that, though. The Dobbs decision has sent the issue back to the states, and a federal ban or protection of abortion in this legislature is all but impossible. It seems that the work of the pro-life movement now should focus on the state level and other pro-life resources for women and children who are in need. Isn't that correct? I actually agree that there have been some losses, and that is on us, particularly after Dobbs. And the reason for the losses have been that the pro-life movement nationally is largely a bureaucratic lobbying organization with very little grassroots or a strong stateside organization. And we fought so long to overturn Roe nationally, and we couldn't have done it without the lobbying arms. But we didn't plan ahead on a state level. We didn't believe it could happen. See, I believe that the end of Roe demonstrates that persistent, principled activism actually can yield real results. And I pray it inspires a stronger pro-life culture over time. But that movement in particular has to also be politically minded in that we have to think about how, once this law was passed to the states, the pro-life movements in those states could take the baton, and we didn't do that. I agree with you on that focus, and my prayer is that in the days ahead that these short-term losses reveal where states need better advocacy, where they need stronger local networks, and more organized grassroots action. The losses that you speak of should wake us up to build a more robust pro-life presence where it's currently weak, to prepare for things like this in a much more effective way, to advocate in the future elections in a better way for the policy battles that are connected to the moral issues of our day. The next question is a super simple one. It says this: how can we view a candidate as a rule of law candidate if their actions seem to contradict that very idea? I know that this question, in a lot of ways, is a major contention for those who don't like certain candidates. And to be honest with you, I have a running list of things that certain candidates have said or done that are inappropriate and even indefensible as a Christian. But listen, any accusation against a candidate must be taken on its own terms. And even if some of the accusations end up being true, it matters which of the accusations are true, and then what impact that has on the job that we're hiring that candidate to do. For example, this is a stark one. Adultery is reprehensible and unchristian, but being an adulterer is not a disqualification in the civic realm to govern. In the church realm, that would be disqualifying, but not for one in the role of an elected official. Otherwise, we should have impeached Jefferson and Jackson and Harding and FDR and JFK and LBJ for the very same reasons. And some would argue that we should have, but we are hiring, this is important, someone to do a dirty job, not to lead a church or a Christian organization. We don't apply this same standard to other professional realms. Here's the parallel that I would make. If I ever needed to have heart surgery, I really don't care about the heart surgeon's personal life, nor do I think it necessarily affects his ability to repair my heart. When I say politics is a dirty job, what I mean is government officials are in a role that is similar. I'm not trying to lower the bar on character as a consideration. I'm just asking, what is the job description? And the job description is one that doesn't require perfect character. All right, the next question. Why isn't the character of the leaders we're voting for one of the most significant things we should be concerned about in electing a politician? To say that we're not electing a pastor-in-chief seems like a false equivalency. If we were talking about a more normal political figure, I wouldn't be concerned. This question has some touch points on the last one that we looked at as well, but I thought we could answer it in a slightly different way here. I think that on some level, we should care about the character of our leaders. But in your question, I think the word significant is up for debate. Significant in what way? One of the many factors that should be considered, but based on the job that is being asked of them, I think can be character. But I think I would prefer to say that character is a consideration among many others. And there is a lot baked into the word normal in your question as well. Normal by whose standards? Leaders with character challenges are not abnormal in the historical scope of elections. And we need to resist recency bias and take the moment as it comes to us and vote accordingly, not the way we wish it could be, but the way that things actually are. All right, the next question is a short one, but it's going to have a longer answer, but it's this. How do you choose which issues to consider when discerning which party to vote for? I think, generally speaking, you need to differentiate between what is called straight line issues and jagged line issues. I get this from Jonathan Lehman. Straight line issues are those where Scripture speaks with very real clarity and directness. They are moral and ethical questions that flow in a very obvious line from biblical teaching to things like public policy. I would say things like religious liberty and marriage and family, sexuality, the rule of law, those kinds of things fall into this category because they touch realities that God Himself has explicitly addressed in His Word. And I do think prudential questions may still come up regarding how to implement those things, but the underlying moral principles, I think, are generally clear. Now, jagged line issues are different. They involve areas where Scripture provides foundational principles, but it doesn't necessarily prescribe a single policy solution. That means this: faithful Christians who share the same theological convictions may end up reaching then different conclusions about the best way to apply biblical principles in that area, the complexity of that area. But this is where I want to make a point here to say the issue of political power comes into play. On jagged line issues, Christians may disagree, and I know of some who disagree about things that I believe about what would be the best policy. But once a citizen becomes convinced that a particular policy is wiser or more just or more conducive to human flourishing, it's right and good to vote for candidates who will advance that policy. In other words, the goal is not only to elect those who will align with straight line issues. I don't think it should be any less than that, but to also attempt to elect those who will advance policies that you believe best reflect justice and promote order, restrain evil, even encourage the common good. If a Christian concludes that a particular, for example, immigration policy or economic framework, tax structure, environmental approach is the wisest application of biblical principles, he should not apologize for supporting candidates who will use their political power to implement those convictions. The question is really not whether political power should be used, but whose vision of the good it will serve. See, political power is unavoidable. The only choice is whether it will be wielded in support of the policies that are more consistent with a biblical wisdom that you have or believe that you have, or policies that are not. So on jagged line issues, yes, Christians should exercise a kind of humility toward other believers who reach different prudential conclusions. But humility does not require neutrality. And that's a thing that I think a lot of evangelicals struggle with. We can acknowledge that faithful Christians may disagree while still working diligently themselves to elect leaders and enact policies that we sincerely believe will best serve our neighbors and honor God's design for human society. The existence of disagreement, this is another important thing here, does not eliminate the responsibility to make judgments. And the last question for today is this: as a Christian, how can I vote for a candidate if I don't agree with every policy proposal that they have brought forth? One of the most important questions that Christians should ask when they're evaluating candidates or parties, platforms, it's not simply, do I agree with every policy proposal, but this: which party or platform is more likely to protect the church's freedom to fulfill its God-given mission? And while Christians, again, may legitimately disagree on many prudential matters, the ability of the church to do things like worship and to preach and disciple, to evangelize, to order its life according to the Scriptures, I think it should be a central concern for the Christian stepping into the voting booth. Governments inevitably shape the environment in which churches and families, schools, all institutions really operate. Laws and policies are not neutral. They either create space for, say, Christian faithfulness, or they increase pressure against it. So Christians should consider not only economic outcomes or foreign policy things, political promises that candidates are making, but whether a party seeks to preserve the freedom of the church to proclaim the gospel, to disciple the nations, and for me, I think about this a lot, to obey Christ without coercion from the state. It's just a reality that some political environments are more hospitable to the church's mission than others. It's okay to say that. A government that protects religious liberty, that protects parental rights, that protects the freedom of the conscience, free speech, that kind of government is creating conditions in which the church can more freely carry out its calling. A government that increasingly treats biblical convictions as dangerous, though, or maybe like discriminatory, intolerable, they place obstacles in the church's path that I think are unnecessary. A government, though, that works with the church's lawful ministry, I think is fundamentally different from one that increasingly seeks to restrict or marginalize or even punish those who hold to historic Christian convictions. And look, I get it. No political party perfectly represents biblical values. They won't ever. They never have. They never will. And no election will usher in the kingdom of God. Christians should still exercise wisdom in determining which candidates and their policies are more conducive to the church carrying out her mission under the lordship of King Jesus. Or maybe I could say it another way. Which one is more likely to preserve the freedom necessary for the church to remain faithful to her King? Hey, thanks again for joining us. If you would, take a second to respond on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. In particular on YouTube, I want to encourage you to like the video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and then hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. We're also on Apple and Spotify podcasts. You can follow us there as well. Turn on the notifications, leave a review. Those reviews, by the way, really help us. Find us on social media. Share the episode there. If you see it, jump into the conversation. Follow us on those accounts. On Instagram, you can follow us at Christianly Pod. On Facebook, Christianly, just that alone. And then give us a follow on X as well, where you can follow us at Christianly_pod. And if you are in the Tulsa area or just passing through, I would love to meet you in person. You can join us at Cross and Crown Church at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings for worship here, where I have the privilege to serve as lead pastor. We meet at Will Rogers Church at 11th and Yale. And finally, as we always say, remember, don't just listen, speak and lead and share the light. And remember that there isn't a corner of this world that doesn't belong to the King.